Not again, not again, not again.
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. I'm Bradley Tuck, and in today's episode we're going to be talking to Amber Ali Frost. Writing in Current Affairs on the political necessity of vulgarity, Amber Ali Frost writes, "Civility is destructive because it perpetuates falsehoods, whilst vulgarity can keep us honest." Amber Ali Frost is a writer and podcaster. She writes for publications such as The Baffler, Current Affairs, Jacobin and New Republic, and is a co-host of the political and satirical podcast Chapo Trap House. In this session, we will be joined by Amber to discuss her work and the current cultural movement known as the Dirtbag left. According to Amber, the cultivation of the dirtbag left involves the embrace of the vulgar and the irreverent, and an absolute zero tolerance for po-faced humourlessness. Fusing radical politics with irreverence and vulgarity, dirtbag leftism attempts to reclaim traits often associated with Trump for the left's own ends. Writing in Current Affairs, Amber writes, "The left will always need its journals and its polemics and academic writing. But there are times when it is both right and proper to terrify the bourgeoisie with your own feralness. Reclaiming vulgarity from the Trumps of the world is imperative because if we do not embrace the profane now and again, we will find ourselves handicapped by our own civility. Vulgarity is the language of the people, and so it should be among the grammar of the left, just as it has been historically, to weld righteously against the corrupt and the powerful. We cannot cede vulgarity to the vulgarians. Collegial intellectuals will always be niche, but class war need not be." In this session, we discuss a range of political issues raised in Amber's work, the ways she integrates humour, satire, irreverence and vulgarity into her work, and the way that the dirtbag left could be seen as constructing a counterculture for our own time. This session was ran as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group's fortnightly meetup. We meet on Zoom every other Tuesday, so if you'd like to join, you can check out our list of events at our website www.explodingappendix.com. You can check us out on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, or you can send us a message at explodingappendix@gmail.com. So this session was recorded on the 23rd of February 2021, and I think that's all that I have to say. So I think now over to the discussion with Amber. What is the dirtbag left, and sort of how did that sort of phrase come about?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Nice to meet all of you. I remember looking at this on the notes you sent me, and I was like, oh, I have no idea when I first said that. But it actually was a tweet. I can't remember my exact wording of, but it was used to describe the podcast Chapo Trap House that I'm on before I was on it, when I was a fan, and it was just my roommates. And I was trying to articulate a kind of a political tendency of people for whom class was the primary political category, and thus had become sort of disgusted with the supplanting of material politics with this sort of vague, repressive, liberal etiquette that's intended to sort of signify your values. And I think it very much sort of, it's a little wallowing, it's a little, I'm disgusting, fuck you. It's a little bit of that. At the time also, we were all really, really broke and lived in a legally sublet 2-bedroom that we had 3 people living in, and it had like black mold and leaks and was falling apart. So the idea of being sort of condescended to by people for having like a sense of humor, or, just speaking a pretty common conventional language that wouldn't offend the average person on the street, it was really insulting. It was just like, what are you doing? And I think also we really resented the conflation of etiquette with like kindness or compassion, things that like we do believe in and being nice to people and generally fair and genial or whatever to people more broadly. That's not the same thing as, this kind of etiquette enforced at the point of a gun, because without which you're going to be completely excluded from the political discussion because you're not serious. Yeah, so it sort of kicked off as a joke, and then it just sort of took off, and people they're like, oh yeah, that's what it is. Like, I have these politics, and I'm not going to confuse what I believe politically or even morally with sort of middle-class values.
I suppose etiquette is a way of sort of signifying your status a lot of the time. That's why etiquette tends to come about.
Yeah. I don't think there's ever really been a break between kind of liberal language of progressivism, or at this point, like the Democratic Party, and the sort of middle-class progressives of like the turn of the century in America. I don't know if there's a difference in the UK, because obviously there's a different like class history. But in the US, you look at the people who have sort of been the forefathers and foremothers of, in particular, this kind of like language that we're so used to being, it's made its way into advertising now. It's hegemonous. There's just no break. These people might as well have been temperance movement feminists or middle-class ladies trying to build more penitentiaries for the poor or whatever. It's just these people thought of themselves as very progressive, or even insofar as like the sciences and really horrifying things like eugenics. Those people were progressive. We're looking at the deficits of the races. These were very refined people who took tea and went to the opera and did all that kind of thing. So, someone who likes both tea and the opera, I'm not letting them have it. They don't have the corner market on morality or politics or kindness or compassion or anything like that. They just have manners.
Yes, and those two things can get really confused, I think.
And one can certainly be used to obfuscate or disguise the lack of the other.
There's a really wonderful piece that you wrote for Current Affairs, which was in 2016, called The Necessity of Political Vulgarity, in which you say that as the 19th century French knew, monarchy is the real barbarity. It was the libellists who were the true allies of the Enlightenment. And then you sort of go on to discuss how sort of libellist drawings of sort of Marie Antoinette with these kind of ostrich-shaped dicks or dick-shaped ostriches, I don't quite know how it goes, were censored alongside really important philosophical texts. And so I wanted to ask, why is it important to have ostrich-themed dick jokes alongside Diderot, Voltaire and Rousseau?
Well, one, because it's funny, and I really think, I believe in like the utility and wholesomeness of a sense of humor. But I think in terms of the vulgarity per se, I think it's declaring a refusal to play along with that etiquette. I guess it's sort of like the idea that we're not going to pretend if we were refined or if we abandoned vulgarity and if we did everything to purge ourselves from it, which I think is a very human kind of impulse. If we essentially domesticated ourselves, it's not like the powers that be would be like, oh, you're nice now. We're going to hand over power or resources or even any base level of dignity. I think there's a lot of talk about punching up versus punching down. I think that kind of entire narrative become very perverse because up and down, interpersonally, that doesn't really... You get into privilege stuff and you start trying to look at the ledger and who has more privilege than anyone else. But in terms of who should be the target of vulgarity, I think the French monarchy is probably a good example of someone who's big enough to take it. In America, I tend to go for major media, major legacy media are fair game. Politicians are fair game. I think a lot of people think that it's just like, oh, she's saying you should just go around being mean to people. And it's like, no, it's going around and laughing at the absurdity of these people's stupid ideas and values, which don't reflect the broader public, or indeed, like, they don't reflect any basic kind of kindness or compassion or egalitarian sensibility. Sorry, that's very rambling, but yeah.
That's good. And so I'm sort of really interested in sort of how this relates to Chapo, and how much do you sort of see Chapo working within a long history of satire?
Yeah, we're all big comedy fans. We all love satire. It's a really strange thing because now I have a successful podcast to support my writing habit. I don't see a huge division between what I do on the podcast and what I would write for like Columbia Journalism Review. One, because my writing has always had humor in it anyway.
Funny.
Yeah, well, I try. Thanks. But two, because I think really the podcast thing is more a matter of the difference between it and my writing has more to do with the form and the medium. Whereas, writing, I get to arrange. It's writing. You get to arrange all of your thoughts and what you hope to be the ideal and most legible and comprehensive yet focused way possible. Whereas with a podcast, it's meandering, it's interactive, and people get to listen to a conversation. And, we do little scripted bits here and there, but largely we're flying by the seat of our pants. That's a very interesting format for comedy and for satire because, one, I mean, it's somewhat improvised, but two, it's based on a kind of like intimacy and friendship, which even to the point where like listening to people have a conversation, like a real conversation, is interesting. Listening to that conversation develop ongoing over the course of years, which I realize at this point some people have been doing, it's strange for me. It must be strange for listeners. But yeah, it's definitely in the tradition of a lot of the comedy that we love, which is like scripted or literary, but we're just talking, which is very funny. And for some reason, people like it. I think it's because there is a dearth of like actual conversation. And it is very refreshing to hear friends that are hopefully at least at sometimes smart and funny and insightful just have a conversation where they're not trying to impress each other or one-up each other. Although we are trying to make each other laugh. There's a competitive element to it. But the friendship medium of the show really is the only thing that I think makes it a little bit different from any historic idea of traditional or literary satire. I mean, it's called Chapo Trap House, for Christ's sake. Like, it's a really ridiculous, silly thing. I think people are sort of starved for conversation. And that's the reason that it took the form it did and the time it did. Maybe if we had gone together under a different political or cultural moment, we would be doing something. I think we'd still work together, but I think it wouldn't be a podcast. Maybe it would be a TV show or a magazine or comic book or something. I think podcasts work for lonely times.
Yeah, there's a certain sense that you can definitely tell that there's a lot of friendship there. Part of it is, I think people just do want to have that sense that they can relate to somebody or relate to people just having their life, really.
And I think when people encounter politics now, it's a lot of sort of posturing. And I also think people are very nervous. They're just sort of like morally and intellectually insecure, and with good reason. I mean, like if you say the wrong thing, someone might go after you. So I think it's sort of a comfort to people to be like, oh, there are still people who are able to talk about politics and culture, and there's no risk involved because they all know each other and care about each other. And the threat of expulsion isn't there. The threat of being a pariah, it's just, I think it's really strange, but everyone's constantly talking about politics, but nobody's actually talking about politics. So to hear people actually just sort of having a conversation as silly and sort of comedy oriented as it is, there's something sort of honest and authentic about just the intimacy of friendship. Gosh, that sounds so corny. But that is very much missing from what it means to be political in this moment.
So in your 2017 piece for the Baffler, which is called All Worked Up and Nowhere to Go, you sort of mentioned Mark Fisher's 2013 piece, Exiting the Vampire's Castle. You explain how the text for you became a sort of preview of the farcically doomed Clinton campaign. So in what respects was this article prescient, and in what respect is it sort of still relevant to us today?
I think Fisher has aged very well. His work has aged very well, which is funny because when you go back and read the K-punk book, there's all of this stuff that's so dated about like house music and stuff. Because a lot of it's just like blog posts and it was like whatever he was into at the time. But it is strange. It's like reading a play review from like Dorothy Parker and, the 30s or something. And it's like, I've never heard of this play. I have no context for this. And yet the reflections on it and the writing on it is so good that I don't need to know. Like, I understand it. That's what a good writer does. And I think in particular, a good critic, whether artistic or cultural, they produce a piece of criticism which, at its bare minimum, has the same artistic or cultural intellectual value as the thing they're criticizing, whether positively or negatively. So it's just a small aside on Fisher that I think it's worth not just reading Exiting the Vampire's Castle, but like read his weird shit on house music. I'm not even into house music, but he writes about it well enough and thoughtfully enough that it's just great writing. It's very thoughtful, and whether you agree with it or disagree with it. But there is a reason why Exiting the Vampire's Castle resonated and still continues to resonate. And it keeps every few years being rebranded as like cancel culture, or trashing was what it was called in the 70s. Basically, I think we are in a situation where class politics are on their back. It's sort of the neoliberal era, which is, I think Ture Reid said, maybe a little bit jokingly, like neoliberalism is best defined as a redistributive wealth project that redistributes upward. I think in that situation, people get very nasty, and the only thing they feel they do have control over is managing their social interactions. The only relationship to politics they have is signaling to other people, whether they're in or out of a group. That's particularly like important to people now too, because people do want to feel like they're a part of a group. As much as we all love our individuality and, you know, supposedly, it's a really atomized time. People are incredibly lonely. They want to be embraced in a sense. And when you do that with politics as an identity rather than sort of a means to an end, politics as a political person being something you are versus something you do, you are essentially constantly auditioning to people who may or may not be suspicious of you or hostile towards you for inclusion into a group. It's very unhealthy. I think it's a function more of the left's weakness. I think people say, well, the right doesn't do this. The right looks for converts and the left looks for heretics. It's like, well, that's because the right's in charge. There's definitely been some times when the right was going after heretics, historically speaking. But it's generally in times of their own decline and in times when sort of progressive or egalitarian or people's or populist movements were eroding sort of traditional or reactionary or highly economically exploitative systems. I'm not sure any way out of it. But I try when I can to point out the absurdity of that kind of gatekeeping and like the coded sort of class politics of it. It's like, you don't know to say this, you don't know how to act this way. A lot of it is about establishing, you know, who went to the right school and who read the right book. And it's like, well, if your politics requires a minor in gender studies, it's probably not going to get off the ground like most people, you know, haven't even been to college. And also, I think people don't want that. I think people are generally compassionate. I think given half a chance, people are very kind and understanding, but you do have to give them that half a chance. And I don't think that that thrives in an environment of, well, we say this here. Well, you said this and we don't say that. And yeah, I mean, it's a difficult thing to get to. It's just like, why are people assholes? It's like, well, some of them are cynics and are just using it to sort of like leverage their own power with whatever petty microsec. But a lot of people are just very scared and are trying to be like good people and, you know, obey the rules. And they're like, this isn't my house. I just got into politics a few years ago. I want to do it right. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. There's a lot of like earnest, good-natured kind of impulses behind it. But it can also be manipulated to very like coercive ends. It's very repressive and it can be incredibly cruel. And as much as I love vulgarity and I love class war, I dislike cruelty. So yeah, I always wish I had a solution. But other than honing what my mother calls a bullshit detector and the ability to sort of be brave and be like, you don't actually believe I'm a bad person. You're attacking me right now for some reason outside of this, to actually point out the absurdity of the Vampire's Castle thing while it's happening. It's kind of the only thing you could do at the moment because it's a function of a weak left, I guess. And I think it'll get better when left politics are stronger.
Is it tied up with neoliberalism as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's provided sort of a ritual I mean, it couldn't have been designed better by Thatcher and Reagan, but it's like, well, you don't really need politics. You don't really need redistribution or democracy or civil rights. What we need is a new way of thinking, a new way of communicating with people. And a lot of that got wrapped up with sort of the cultural turn in the university, why they're in charge of how good people are supposed to speak or interact with each other. I don't know how that decision was made. It confuses me to this day why the university has such an outsized influence on, especially given its own history as one of reproducing the upper classes, why they got to be in charge of, I guess it's Enlightenment values. I don't know enough about the history of the university or whatever, but it's like they're really coasting on those Enlightenment values however many years later, particularly with regard to their hand in truly horrible things. I mean, like eugenics, the war machine, interventionist foreign policy, imperialism, deep state stuff. There's nothing inherently good about being an intellectual. The James Bond villain trope of an evil genius exists for a reason. I departed too much from the question, but yes, I think actually it is essentially a codified sort of behavioral system that neoliberalism has maybe not consciously designed, but shaped to keep people away from politics and keep them looking left to right instead of looking up as the source of their suffering.
It's almost like with something like human resources, which comes in with the sort of demise of unions, but then you still need to manage disputes within the workplace. So it becomes these new kind of policies and procedures that come through something like human resources management.
Yeah, absolutely. I gave a talk on union organizing among like tech workers, and it was like really screwed up. But like at the end of the Q&A section, we realized about a third of the people there were maybe like management, and they knew what they were doing. But, I actually said early on, I was like, so I don't know what you all do or what your position is, but functionally, there are people who work for a wage. There are people who manage people, tech. And I sort of went into the ways in which tech is sort of uniquely difficult to organize because there's no a lot of it's remote. There's no physical space. There's a reason why a lot of times teachers unions or factory workers unions, one of the first demands is a break room that the boss can't come into. That's just for the workers because you need a quiet corner to conspire against the boss. And that's also, I think, why tech favors these big open floor plans because there's no corners and they can basically always watch you and make sure you're not saying, well, how much do you get paid? Well, are you getting overtime? Whatever. And I think it's been an interesting thing to see people pivot to, wait a minute, HR doesn't work for me. HR works for the boss. And it might be a tool that you have to use. I mean, if you're being sexually harassed, if you're being abused or bullied at work, you may have to use HR. But make no mistake, the reason HR exists is to protect the employer. And to sort of think of things in that way, not like, oh, the company is going to help me, is going to protect me from this person who I work with. You have to think, look, the company doesn't want a lawsuit and they don't want a chaotic sort of workforce because then they're less efficient. I may have to go to this company representative at some point to preserve myself. But if I'm too much trouble, they'd get rid of me just as soon as they got rid of the person being cruel to me. The idea of unions as an internal moderating force that actually work for the workers is very exciting to people, but they first have to get over that initial hump of like, oh, wait, HR works for the company. They don't work for me, which I thought was very sort of like rudimentary. But I think in things like tech specifically too, you're looking at people, their HR people have like the most moral credentials. Like they've all got pictures of themselves, like, building a well in Africa or whatever. They're all super social justice-y. This new wave of people all have, they've all sort of studied the humanities. And it's like, oh, these people have basically been trained to provide a moral alibi for capital, and they're very convincing at it. To the untrained sort of liberal eye, it's like, oh, this woman is a feminist and she goes hiking. She's not working for Google. She's here to help me.
You know, you're just saying like a moral alibi for capital. I've been looking into some of the policies relating to arts here, but like how it actually becomes a vehicle for social policy. So this sort of implication that, you know, of social exclusion or whatever, that it's some sort of social behaviour that, you know, these people are in this situation because they can't socially include themselves in the right way. And so if we can just teach them to behave in the right way, then that will make them, you know, it's nothing to do with the fact that there's like structural inequalities or anything. We just need to make them behave properly and then they'll be included. And the way that then reproduces itself, like in the sort of mentality of people, like, and how we expect behaviours to relate to some sort of we start to believe this stuff, you know, and it all becomes put into our policy and stuff. But I think I really like that, like a moral alibi for capital is like perfect way of putting it. Like,
yeah, and of course it points out a villain that isn't. In that same like talk, by the way, someone said, well, what do I do if someone who's like alt-right wants to be in the union? And I'm like, well, that means you won. Like, you know, this person might have abhorrent politics, but fundamentally, like, the function of a union is that everyone on the shop floor is in the same organizing group, and any absence of someone who you're working with is a weakness of the union, even if that person sucks personally. But if you appeal to people's sort of self-interest and you're like, look, we want more hours or less hours or more pay or whatever it is we want. And to be able to sort of organize with people on that level is obviously like the goal. The only thing is that I think people are very fearful that their own politics are very vulnerable. And if they're around people with bad politics, it will like infect them like a disease. And all of a sudden everyone will become a reactionary zombie or something. When in fact, I think participation in labor politics works the other direction, where if you are working with someone for the same goal, and you do have a shared interest, it behooves you to figure out who they are, what they're like, to develop some sort of appreciation for their skills and their personhood. You're always going to have like difficulties in any kind of political or look, people are hell, and as soon as there's two of them, there's a conflict. But the idea that people are more, I guess they have more faith, or at least middle class people have more faith that HR is on their side than like the weird guy who's at the cubicle next to them, even though he's in the same content minds or coding minds that they are. It speaks to sort of a very, well, it's not good, first of all, but it speaks to an adoration of power and an aspiration to be the boss. And I got the impression there's a few people there who was like, oh, you're just trying to get the corner office. This has nothing to do with, you know, anything. But, you know, that's sort of like just an element of like navigating like this new workplace, is that they've really refined their tools of convincing people that the boss loves you and they're your friend and they just want everyone to have a good time and we're doing something important here. I think that's less plausible to someone with a really shitty job, be it white collar or blue collar, but there's definitely a certain class of people, and I think particularly in things like tech, where they're like, yeah, we're all on the same team. We're doing something amazing here. We're the future. And it's like they're extracting your labor. Like it is. It's very powerful. They're really good at it. They're really good at looking like the good guys. They have whole teams of it.
I think Rob just put a comment saying that they use the word family a lot.
Yeah, my partner works in a recruitment agency, and the management are really into describing the whole organisation as a family. And it's very perverse. And then she had an interview somewhere else and they did the same thing. It was at Bupa, actually, which is like the private healthcare company in the UK. And it's so perverse for obvious reasons.
That's so funny. Yeah, a family where your dad might fire you. That's a good comment. Yeah.
I've always found that companies that say, we're a family here, are the worst companies to work for. They always treat you like crap. And then they're like completely lie to themselves about it. Like, oh, I've treated everyone like family today because they've said it 5 times that day. But they didn't actually treat anyone with any respect.
It's like, what is your family like? It's like, oh my God. Do you send your children to work like I do? It's very creepy. And the other thing that I think of is like, you know, who else calls themselves a family that's very coercive and abusive and creates a dependency, is a cult. We're a family. You know, it's like, Yeah.
Startups use that. I remember working for this coffee startup in London, and they used to have a fridge full of beer that anyone could grab at any time. They would provide lunch twice a week, and they'd get some really nice food in. And then they would also do mass purges where they would fire about 25 people in one go.
Oh, yeah. Did anyone ever read Fordlandia? So this is like this amazing book. So Henry Ford, American auto magnate and like massive anti-Semite and like race scientist, he wanted to manufacture rubber more cheaply. So he opened up his own company town in like the middle of the jungle of Brazil, called it Fordlandia. So talk about like God complex. And he hired just people from nearby villagers. I think it's been a while since I've read it, but I think they were largely like indigenous. You know, these are people who do not come from like, you know, it was Brazil in, I forget what year it was open, but it wasn't like an industrialized workforce. And he's like, I'm going to build like basically a compound, which there's a whole, I guess there's a similar thing in the UK too, where like, you know, they would build houses around, say, the coal mining industry. In the US, where I'm from, there's a place called Gary, Indiana, where it's all steel. And all the little houses, which at the time were very nice little houses, were basically built by steel in a kind of capitalist planned community. So when people are against any kind of planned economy, I'm like, well, it works fine when capital does it. So I don't know why we can't do it. But he tried to do the same thing in the middle of like the Brazilian jungle. And he built like dorms and like tried to make it sort of all encompassing, all including. They still had the Latin American and European, in some ways, tradition of like going home for lunch. And the final thing that made the workers revolt, keep in mind here, these are like literal peasants just moved into sort of wage labor, is that he provided a cafeteria. And they were like, you're trying to make us not go home for lunch. You're trying to keep us here. What you're doing is not nice. I see through that. You're trying to have like a captive labor base. And if I want to go home and get drunk on my lunch break and come back and can still do the job, I can do that. If I want to go visit a prostitute on my lunch break, I can do that. If I want to take a nap, read a book, whatever, I can do that. That's my time outside of work. And they trashed the place. Like they trashed the entire, they trashed Fordlandia because they were so insulted. And it was so obvious to them that he was essentially trying to create a kind of midway between a plantation and like an industrial sort of capital sort of manufacturing process. Now, those were literally peasants. You take someone who has like 6 years of university and you do the same thing to them. And you're like, oh, look, you can bring your dog. Oh, look, you can get your flu shot here. Oh, look, you can go to a cafeteria. There's food here. You can have a beer afterwards. You never have to leave work. They're so domesticated that they're like, oh, that's so nice of you. And it's like, workers rioted. They used to riot when there was like a cafeteria option introduced because they're like, I know what you're doing. But I think, yeah, the neoliberal kind of, I don't know what it is, kind of brainwashing is very strong with startups, with tech. It's a whole culture. They've really, I think people are a little more wise to it now, but people really liked the idea of never having to leave work. These bosses figured out a way to trick people into thinking that staying at work would be fine as long as there were a few amenities at work. But no, it's still work. And the Brazilian peasants knew that. We should remind ourselves.
That's very true. I mean, in the arts, I worked for a small arts organisation, not-for-profit, registered charity, had all these values around wanting to affect change in the world and committed to climate justice and so forth. And there's a cafe, there's a bar, and no one took lunch breaks. Or if they did, they would go in the kitchen, sit around for an hour. But the bosses would always be working in front of their computers. Right. And we almost felt a bit ashamed, if you're going, I'm going to take an hour lunch break and actually leave the building, go somewhere, or I'm going to 5:30 in the afternoon, instead of 7 o'clock or 7:30. And if you try to claim overtime, for time off in lieu sorry, there was no overtime pay, but time off in lieu of working extra hours, they really said, no, there's something wrong, because this isn't like working in McDonald's. This is working for the arts. You're supposed to love it. You're supposed to work 12 hours a night, and never take time off. It's pleasure. We're not working as nurses or something. So you kind of get that in the cultural sector hugely. It does feel like the idea of the family, as someone said, almost like having to be these social justice warriors. And if you go against the grain of something that you might disagree with some of the political direction that an arts charity is going, or even if you might do something on social media which goes against the values of the organisation, that's it. You are a pariah. They will try and get rid of you and control. So I remember they said, right, we're going to introduce a social media policy of what you can and cannot say on social media, for example.
Right. Yeah, in your private time, you're never off work. Yeah.
Life. And so any idea of yourself as an individual or yourself as part of this kind of, okay, I know we're all on the left here, but this collective, this kind of, that collective thinking becomes all encompassing, and you're not allowed to deviate from those values, those norms.
And I think it obfuscates the actual collective potential that would be among a workforce, because it creates kind of a false category of a collective where it's like, yeah, we're all in it together. And it's like, with the bosses, where it prevents and is designed to prevent actual collective action from below. And I kind of wonder, so, when I would work like food service or something, and, Midwestern Protestant workaholics, like we all just work constantly, to the point where I literally had to go somewhere else to be like, oh, culturally, I come from insane people. We were very adamant about people taking breaks. And when someone was like, oh, I just need to finish this, we would be like, no, take a break. And your coworkers would be like, no, take a break, because it doesn't matter if you don't want to take a break. I might want to take a break. And if you work overtime, or if you work off the clock, then you're making the rest of us look bad. You're raising the expectations. Like, we all need to agree how much we're all going to work together, because obviously the manager wants to get as much work out of us as he or she possibly can. And we need to not set precedents that will, even if you do have time to work at the moment, we need to not set precedents that will make it more difficult for us to take breaks in the future when we do need to. Does that exist sort of in that sense of no, go on your break in professional settings or in more white collar or the arts or anything like that? Because I'm always curious, where is the person yelling at their coworker, no, you're making us look bad. We have to all agree how much we're all going to work together. Otherwise, we're going to be undercutting each other and used against each other. My work experiences, well, I graduated in the midst of 2008 financial collapse. So my work experience is food service, childcare, a little bit of adjunct teaching, and being on a podcast. So it's a very different thing. I am very curious about these kind of office environments.
Well, some of it you touched on. Open plan is the de rigueur in the creative sector, and so the boss is literally only a few yards away from you. There's no hiding, and I think the best way of hiding is that if you just got a good big Mac screen that you could just hide behind. I actually just would sit in the far corner so they couldn't see me, because I felt that they're constantly helicoptering around, and also no one wanted to be, and this is kind of very young, trendy, hip arts organisation. No one wanted to be a member of a trade union. I was the only person that was a trade union member, and I depended on them for a sort of formal disciplinary situation for something I did privately on social media, where I just liked a bad joke, the kind of.
Oh yeah.
And that was it. I got hauled in, because about 100 other artists complained, saying, "How can this guy work for this enlightened organisation when he likes a really crude joke?" The crude joke was about a politician, actually, not not sort of anything sexual or anything like that.
That's so funny. And it's weird too that they would be, I mean, it really does not speak to the radical potential, at least at present, of the kind of white collar and liberal professions, that their first impulse is, we have to fire this person, not why is this company watching your social media? You're not at work. It's not on the company's page. This has nothing to do with this. This is not your business. Stay away from people's lives. I show up and I sell my labor to you, and that is the end of our transaction. Yeah, I'm really not optimistic about the liberal professions. Who knows? Maybe they've surprised me before.
I'm a gardener, and you have that issue all the time. I think it's often something like if you're passionate about what you work as, and quite often in the arts and in like things like gardening and stuff, and like other sports as well, people are expected to give their labor for free because they love it so much. And it's like, oh, but you're so replaceable because there's so many people who love it so much. So you have to work your ass off in order to deserve your spot. And I'm like, excuse me, no. You have it like, particularly in gardening, it's a very low paid sector, and we have, similar to the arts, you have a lot of volunteers as well. So if you are not seen to be loving your job and like so dedicated, and all of these other like words that I find really triggering, like dedication, hardworking and stuff, I'm like, it's a job. I will give my labor to what you pay me for. But they often expect you to be 24/7. Any emergency, you're there and you're not on call and things like that. And they really do not treat employees with respect. And it's, luckily one of my very first jobs was in a university, and we had a very strong trade union. But it was only about a third of the employees were part of the trade union, and they often got persecuted by the organization, those trade union members, because everyone was very open about it, by management, just because they knew that, oh, these are the people who aren't going to work as hard for us. These are the people who are X, Y, and Z. And it's a real neoliberal stigma that has been created, particularly in jobs that people love. If it's a job that is a bit more transactional, I think it is easier to have boundaries. But in a job that you really love or you have passion for, you really take the piss.
There's a really good book about this by Miya Tokumitsu. I think it's just called Do What You Love. Yes, Do What You Love and Other Lies About Success and Happiness. Miya Tokumitsu she's an editor at Jacobin. She writes a lot about parenting and stuff, but she also wrote this really good essay that then got turned into a book about the idea of like loving your job. And I think the thing is like, one, there's no work, no matter how rewarding, no matter how fun, that isn't a pain in the ass sometimes. I mean, like, talk to a parent sometime. They're like, this is the most important living creature in my life. I love them so much and I hate them today. That's the nature of work. But also the distinction between work and a job has been kind of erased. So particularly people who have or feel that they have meaningful work, something that's important to them that they like, they're expected to, and there's a kind of moral stigma attached to recognizing that it is a job, because there's this focus on the work. Yeah, we do the work. It's like, okay, but this is a job too. I've had lots of jobs where honestly some of the most rewarding jobs I've had, it's just so clear what I'm doing. Like I'm loading things onto a truck, sort of warehouse. Not with my hands, I'm not that strong, but I drove a forklift. Or I'm taking care of a baby or kid. That's some of the work I've liked doing best, because there's far fewer days when you go in where you're like, what am I even doing? Which I think is some of the, more alienated labor now, like people working at call centers and things like that. There's just like, there's a, what am I doing? But it's like, if you're taking care of a baby or loading a truck, it's pretty clear you're taking care of a baby or loading a truck. And there is a sort of satisfaction with that you don't necessarily get from like intellectual work. But those also have not always been my favorite jobs. I liked the work, but didn't necessarily like the job. It's rewarding, but it's not just the taking care of the baby or the loading the truck. It's how you are expected to interact with people, how you are expected to interact with your boss, how your work is coordinated, whether you're being observed or watched or not. There's a huge difference between the work and the job. So I might love the work more often than not, but it can still be a shitty job. And the boss's imperative is to obfuscate the difference between work and job. And yeah, to make you feel like, oh, you should be grateful that you're not loading a truck. And it's like, well, loading a truck had way more dignity than adjunct teaching this class where I'm being observed. And, they paid about the same. So what's the fucking point? Like, oh, I get to use my brain. Overrated, frankly. I'll use my brain on my free time.
I had a job as a coder at a family company, and with coding you have long periods of time in which you're just reading code that you either haven't coded or you coded loads of jobs ago, so you have to just read it and kind of suss out what you're doing. And the upper management used to just caution me for doing nothing whilst I was literally reading code.
Yeah.
It's the most mind-numbing hard work, but no, I'm just sat there doing nothing.
Yeah, as your brain is turning to pudding. Yeah, like the tedious stuff too. That's a completely different type of exhaustion, where it's like hard, heavy work with your hands and your bodies is physically exhausting. But provided you aren't overworked, there's like a certain type of personality, myself among them, who I'm like, we're moving this stuff today. And like, you feel very active and you can sort of like, especially if it's social and you can talk to people while you're doing it. But like the isolated kind of brain labor is a specific type of exhaustion. And it's incredibly frustrating when you realize too that like your bosses don't know what your job is. They don't even know what they're employing you to do. And they're mad at you for being lazy, for doing something that they, one, can't do, and two, can't recognize that you're doing. Yeah. And I think that's another way too, that like kind of like white collar work is particularly degraded at this point, where it's like, so much of it now is you are kind of a mechanical Turk, and going through lines and lines and lines of code is like there is just a kind of tired that is hard to even explain when you've been doing the most boring part of a project that maybe even you love doing, but the boring part still has to be done. It's incredibly frustrating, and I think it also isolates people. They get a little brain numb, and it makes it a little more difficult to analyze the workers' dynamics going on around you. I think a lot of white collar work essentially bores you into submission.
Yeah, I regularly rage quit of just like, right, that's it. I'm not mushing my brain anymore, and I just quit like dev completely and just take up another job. It's worth more to me than the like other tech friends and friends from the company are all learning way more money than me. But like, I'm not doing that to my brain for them.
Yeah, there's quality of life to consider. Some people, I guess, are better at this or that. I mean, people have different like propensities and talents and skills. I can do some of the most boring work in the world if I can talk while I'm doing it. So like waitressing and bartending was always really, I liked it. I was a terrible waitress. I was a very good bartender. But, like the social thing is very important to me. And some people can sit quietly and, spend days at the library studying this or coding or whatever. I would lose my mind. But even for people who have like a propensity towards that, everyone has a breaking point. You can't stare at a screen forever and not lose your mind, no matter how much of a screen staring oriented person you are intellectually.
This is really, really poignant to kind of my last year. So it's actually been very, very enjoyable. I wanted to play a little bit of devil's advocate, and I might sound like half a tanky and half a capitalist at the same time. I've been doing blue collar stuff, working in factories, and I kind of see why you would push against like kind of ideal of a family work environment. And then same with the gardening thing. But like I had an old housemate who used to work for Google, and they absolutely loved their job. They did programming for them. And what was probably something that I find a little bit difficult is Google was simultaneously kind of a very capitalist, profit-driven oriented business, simultaneously had a lot of kind of like very socialist aspects to it. So unlike somebody that is abused for their wages and not paid enough, he got a really good salary. They had loads of progressions. If he disagreed with anything that the company said, they would put him on some work board to say, you can participate in making this better and improving our systems. And I think that my criticism of what he was doing would be the structural, the really large scale things that Google as an enterprise was doing. But his life was incredibly meaningful in a way that other people didn't have. And even though some of those things were like, you'll get a meal if you work until 6:30, which is obviously exploiting and trying to manipulate people to work longer hours, but also it made him feel like a family, and it also gave a bit of meaning to what he did. It was just that he thought that Google was leading the revolutionary charge with coding.
Yeah. I mean, I think that these companies have like gotten really, really, really good at giving people a simulating sort of like intimacy and care and family, and obscuring the fact that this is a job and you're at work and they're buying labor power, etc. But I don't think that impulse is a bad thing. People do want to feel like they're a part of a project. And historically, like workplaces, when those power dynamics or whatever you want to call them are clear and obvious, the sort of, for lack of a better word, families formed at work can be very good, healthy things. Your friend sounds like one of the lucky ones. Obviously, that makes it easier to believe that Google is leading the revolution. But I do think, it's very meaningful and cool, and it makes you feel good and close to people, not just the people that you work with, but like people more broadly. You get a sense of universalism when you, as a worker with other workers, organize something. And like that does produce family feelings. There are different ways to form families, and that is one of them. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It's more that like, it's not a family if your dad can fire you,
Just listen to a Behind the Bastards podcast episode about Krupp steel in the 1800s and how this German guy basically created a welfare system. And it was one of the very first welfare systems ever. And it's still the basis of the welfare system in Germany. And it was solely to
Oh my God, that's so German.
Yeah, but it was solely to stop his employees becoming socialists or communists. It was to stop the rise of communism. So he housed everybody, he gave them welfare, he gave them pensions and everything. But it ended up, he basically owned them. And it was the exact same thing that, the Googles of the world are doing now. And it's just in this, like, particularly in America, where the welfare system is more eroded, it is like, we'll work for these people forever and we get our healthcare and we get our meals and our family are taken care of. Yeah, that's true. But you just don't necessarily, it's like a fallacy of freedom, of rights, of like, it's to stop unions.
Yeah. It's not just that it's eroded, it's that it never even developed to the point of any European. It's it has declined, but it never even reached the peaks of even UK welfare, much less like Scandinavia in the 70s or France or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, that was what we called the company town. But that's amazing. That's like the basis of that's the most German piece of German welfare history I've ever heard. He
was also, he made cannons. That's how he made his money. So it was like he created all of the wars and created like the First World War because he just.
That's amazing. I mean, it sounds like you're describing an American, but yeah,
he's the capitalist dream, isn't he?
Yeah. Wait, what was this podcast called? Because I actually do want to look this up at some point. So that's amazing.
Behind the Bastards.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite good. It's a pretty good podcast for like, I think Robert Evans is the host. But yeah, they do quite a lot. So they did like a big podcast about the insurrections in Portland and stuff like that, and all about police brutality. But their main one, Behind the Bastards, is like focusing just on bastards from history and their lives. It's really good. Yeah,
that's great. the company town thing, I guess I do think of it as probably just like, because I'm a big old American, as being more of an American development. But, you know, coal magnates did it in the UK at least. And clearly, like, it was steel did it in Germany. But, like, again, from my home state, there's an entire town that was, like, planned by a steel magnate. For Henry Ford, who tried to do the same thing with Fordlandia, and they all just trashed the place. His anti-communism, he just, like, married it to just anti-Semitism. And he was like, I'm here to take care of you. By the way, the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy is coming here to destroy your life and take away all the gains that I've made for you. It allows them to like sort of keep you captive, whether that be in a Google break room or a steel town where the CEO owns the newspaper even. It's a pretty good system. They figured it out. They really got us good on that one.
One thing I was wondering, if you don't mind me asking, with the idea of the company town, etc., do you think it's a slightly different idea now, maybe, with, talk to my grandfather, for example, worked for the electricity company all his life, went through their, great time. However, nowadays, do you think maybe there's more of a scarcity aspect, like we could take away your job, there's lots of you, you're disposable, it's like, it's not like we're going to look after you, it's more we could replace you sort of thing.
Obviously, like, high unemployment is like really advantageous for these people. Whereas during the economy, when, at least in America, like the manufacturing boom was really benefiting people, it was like, we have to hire more people. We're building new things. We're doing stuff. And that became like, so it was a good time for workers because, employment was high. And if, you didn't like your job, you could say, go to hell. And then you would go get another one. Yeah. Workers having the choice is a huge factor in it. But I also think you're right. That there's a different factor that I couldn't really articulate given more time with it probably either. But there's something different about the corrals, the company towns now. And a lot of that, I think, maybe just has to do with there being at least in the US, like no welfare state, like alternative. So like even you just won't have healthcare, or you'll get on like you're just so screwed being unemployed that like it really got you by the balls. I don't know what to say. Like it's just being fired is much worse now than it was. It's much more dangerous. It's much more fraught, certainly.
Like you can't leave, you have to be fired sort of thing. Like from my understanding of American job laws and stuff like that, if you leave, you can't go on any sort of welfare, but if you're fired, you can claim like some form of job seekers. But yes.
It's really hard to get on the dole, and then no one is eligible for it. And I remember once when I was on unemployment, I called the office and it was around to renew, and it was around Christmas, and the call waiting was like hours and hours because everyone got laid off before Christmas. And I was just like, I'm not getting my check this month. And I just didn't, because like the systems are intentionally overburdened so that people become anti-welfare, because they make dealing with welfare offices so bureaucratic and inefficient intentionally, so that people are like, well, obviously this doesn't work.
Another aspect, I found your point very interesting with this. Classically, if you think about like the workers, there was kind of like someone preaching on a street corner about workers' rights, and there's gatherings and stuff like that. Do you think there's like, I guess we're kind of doing a gathering now, but do you think that the gatherings are something that's not as common, maybe because of apathy, or maybe because it's just not a space that's really taken seriously, like as the people going and discussing consciousness raising, that sort of stuff?
I was wondering if you could tease that out a little bit, because I think there are two directions I'm sort of thinking in at the moment.
I guess riots in Aberystwyth, which is like a little town up in Scotland. I just saw a thing recently about them kind of rallying together and kicking some fascist politics out, if that makes sense. And kind of you don't hear about that sort of thing nowadays really in the same sort of way. Like politics seems to be something that some people feel is, as you were saying, reserved for the intellectual people that can do the language, if that makes sense, not really for the people.
Yeah, I mean, in the States, at least, I think so many people are just generally checked out because there's just like the levers of power, be they in like labor or party politics, are so remote and not just distant, but like the machinations are like impossible to understand. Like every once in a while, and again, I talk about and write about politics for a living, I'll read something in the paper and I'll be like, what is that committee? I've never heard of them. It's literally just such a big mess that, and intentionally so, that people can't imagine their participation in it, much less their influence over it. I think with Sanders, we had an advantage in particular because he was like, we want Medicare for all. Healthcare is like the biggest issue in American politics. And people were like, oh, okay, here's something I can like grab onto. Now I think things like, kicking a right-wing politician out is the sort of membership principle of the Democratic Party and the sort of like disciplining principle. It's like, well, how could you ask for Medicare for all? Don't you know that up until Trump left office, this is a disaster. We don't have time for that right now. There's a fascist in office. So it's been used as a way to get people to not ask for things because you're considered like selfish for being like, I can't afford insulin. But yeah, I mean, I think basically politics, again, reserved for a small number of people, but also positioned as like an adversarial sport rather than a broader fight for control over the world and the economy. And if you just like don't care because it doesn't affect you, I mean, like it will not affect me who my next senator is. Or if it does, it would be in such minor or subtle ways that the vast majority of people are like, I'm not going to dedicate all my time to figuring out, the party players because one, I have one vote, and two, nothing will change. But, maybe that's more of an American context. We're really disenfranchised at this point. We're not encouraged really to vote except for under sort of threat of like moral contempt. It's like, oh, you don't vote. But it's like, well, what are you doing for them? They don't owe you a vote. Like, they don't owe you shit. Like, what have you done for me lately? People are checked out, and I think it's reasonable. I don't think people are like apathetic. I think they have a realistic understanding of their limited amount of power.
I was wanting to ask you a little bit about your sorry ass, which is sort of or the Baffler. So I was wanting to ask a sort of very general question, which was really about, because you obviously received different messages from different people from the left. I wondered what sort of insight did that give you, and I suppose to the Baffler readership, I guess, but also to the left, I suppose, more generally. What was the psyche of the left, and what did you sort of learn from that process?
So yeah, they gave me like an advice column, and I'm like, I'm drunk right now. Why would you? No, it was like it's like sure, yeah. And people liked the idea, and I think because of Chapo and other writing, I provided a sort of like reassuring voice to people. And eventually the column got turned into just a regular column, especially because I started getting the same questions over and over again, which is very interesting. And then columns on hold, so I finished this book that I'm behind on. But it was truly fascinating. I never, unlike many far less ethical advice columnists, I never like wrote in my own thing. I rarely asked people to write to me. It was generally people who either read the Baffler or liked Chapo or liked my writing. And I think I actually put notes here. It's like, so obviously with advice, the kind of the dirty little secret is that most people aren't asking for advice. They're asking for permission, either to do what they want to do or at least feel permission to feel how they're feeling, which that sounds flip, but it's totally healthy. I mean, like, how many times have you been like, I need some advice, or, maybe you don't introduce it that way, but you're like, this person is doing this to me. And then basically you're like, am I being a bitch? Like what you're actually asking is it okay that I feel this way? Am I being unreasonable? Can I confront this person? Whatever, because it's already what I want to do. And that's what most advice is. That's healthy. It's social. It's checking in with people to make sure that you're not being a bitch. But I actually found more often than not, people wrote to me because they like genuinely did not know what to do or how to feel, which I think speaks to a sort of strange, one, it speaks to the political sort of theme of the column, but also to, I think, a moment when people are like, oh no, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm very unhappy and I want to be a good person and do things, but I don't know how, and I don't know why I feel this bad and what's going on. So I had a few, like there were 3 basic themes that I wrote down that like almost everything came under one of these maybe 80% came under one of these three things. One was questions of identity. Not all of it was like gender identity, but a lot of it was. And it was sort of a lot of young people dealing with issues of like sexuality or gender who found the sort of like environment of the kind of progressive or leftist gender thing to be like repressive, or it made them nervous or uncomfortable. Or I got so many people asking. One of them was like 18 years old, and they were like, it's like I went to my first like meeting of this organization, and they go around and they're asking pronouns, and like, I don't know. And they didn't really have like it wasn't I don't know because I believe there are two genders. It wasn't I don't know because I haven't done the reading on what this means, or I want to, but like literally I do not know. And this feels like a kind of like, I don't think they've like, it is a very personal question, especially like, who knows who they are at 18? And people were like, I feel like a lot of pressure, and the relationship to identity feels like another job, because I have to tell everyone who I am, and like, you know, give like a certain biography. And there was other stuff with like different immigrant backgrounds too, where people were like, I don't know, like I have a white collar job, but I speak Mandarin to my family. Like I don't know if I like identifying as a POC. It's a little more complicated than that. So I think that was a huge thing, is that people they felt that they sort of wanted to be free, not just to have their identity or discover their identity, but also free from an identity at times, where they're like, I don't know why we all have to. One friend of mine who's like an older gender queer person was like, I don't know, I spend like half the 90s in the dress, but why do you need to know my pronouns while we talk about rent law? Like it was this weird thing where people felt that it was a very personal thing they were asking to be, they had to biographize or whatever. And it was just like, this is not what I expected at all. So there was a lot of stuff about that. People sort of felt nervous about having to be a certain type of person, or know how to represent themselves correctly, or even just know who they are, which I don't know who I am. So a lot of them was just navigating political activism more broadly, a lot of Vampire's Castle stuff. And it was like, there's a really mean, crazy person in our group. What do we do? And the third, you know, still going back to Fisher, is just loneliness, isolation, depression, like just the mood of the times. And it was just like, it was those three things over and over again, which I think are like totally linked. Like one, the sort of pressures and anxieties around identity. Two, like how you have to like inhabit an identity to like be an activist now. And three, like, oh dear God, I'm so lonely and sad. And it was a really strange experience, but I really liked it. And I think people did feel better. Even when I wasn't particularly insightful, I would get like thank yous where I'm just like, oh, of course you feel bad. Things are bad. It's okay to feel bad. Like it was just like stuff, like the most basic, simple stuff is like apparently like a total relief. So my initial fears about not being a good advice columnist were totally assuaged, because it's like, oh, you don't even need to be smart. You can just like be sympathetic and have common sense and tell people it's okay that they feel bad. And that does like 90% of the relief work for people's psyches. You can be an idiot like me and give great advice.
It's actually it's a really fun read as well.
Yeah, I liked the format of it too, because I got to like make jokes and be charming. And I love, if I can turn anything into like a tap dance where I show off, I'm gonna do it. Yeah, it's also like makes talking about more serious stuff easier, and I think put people at ease a lot. Where it's just like, yeah, but I'm not your priest, but I'm nice and I can make you laugh, and I'm here to tell you that you're not alone. And actually, you have totally valid reasons for feeling the way you do. I never got any psychos, which I was kind of hoping for, like at least one person where I would have to be like, you're insane. Like that would have been fun. Where I'm like, oh no, you actually are the exception. You are being irrational. your response is not, okay, you can't do that. But I don't think I ever got one.
I kind of really relate to what you were saying about the gender thing, about having to, personally, as someone that doesn't sort of really particularly gender conform, having to then suddenly talk about your pronouns or whatever at the beginning of a conversation is really kind of personal. I completely get that.
It seems kind of rude, like an invasive question. But I think it also speaks to this idea that people don't know how political organizations are supposed to function, and they're trying different things out. So the interface or whatever that they're focusing on is like, who are you? What's your story? And it's like, I don't know my story. And also, I don't know why you have to know my story for us to work on housing stuff. It is also interesting to be able to provide historical context for any of those things, like navigating political activism, when it's like, oh, there's a mean person in this group or whatever. Like, when you've read enough memoir, I think people don't read enough memoir. They read a lot of theory and philosophy and economics, but like memoir of people who had good and bad experiences organizing is really useful, even knowing that they may in fact embellish or be unreliable narrators. So to be able to say like, what you're describing has happened before, Richard Wright wrote about it, or Vivian Gornick wrote about it, or, this social dynamic is common. And with the identity stuff, there's all kinds of precedent with that, with the CP, more with what they called like white chauvinist politics or anti-racist politics. But it was also useful to sort of introduce the queer histories that have not really been, that have sort of been tossed out. So with the gender stuff, I was always like, people should read like Christine Jorgensen's memoir, who's like the first early like transgender celebrity, or like Jane County, who was like a Warhol superstar. And these people talk about, and these are, whatever, foremothers of this or that movement. Or read this memoir by this like lesbian hitchhiker. I can't remember what it's called. But it's like these people don't talk about their experiences using any of the language that we have now decided is the only language used to talk about gender. And the other thing I remind people is that like whatever you think about gender right now that you are like so sure of will look really stupid in 10 years because we haven't reached the end of history with like, we haven't figured it all out. So maybe like cut people some slack, and maybe it doesn't make sense to be so sure of yourself or to be so dogmatic about it. It's like, no, we've figured out gender. It's like, no, like there's people have been writing about this stuff and about their experiences for a long time. The only thing we know for sure is that how we feel about it and how we talk about it does change according to the social and political and historical context. So, relax.
So one of the things that you write in one of your sections for Your Sorry Ass, you say, don't worry about your lack of wokeness, it's an organising advantage. So I wondered why, for you, does sort of dirtbaggery come with sort of strategic advantages?
Honestly, it's about being able to talk to people. And like what is considered dirtbaggery, it's using what they would call us and taking it as a point of pride. What it actually refers to is just an ability to talk to people who are whatever, the common people, which is just everyone. And the truth is that, vulgarity, a sense of humor, common speech, maybe some slang, being good with words but not pretentious, being able to express yourself well, but not being self-serious about it, that is how people like to be spoken to. You're talking to them like they're adults and like they're smart enough to keep up because they are, and like they can take a joke because they can, and like you're not a perfect, well-mannered person because they aren't either, but that you're on their side. And I think growing up in a very conservative area puts me in many ways at an advantage to the people I met who have basically always, they've been, two college professor parents or whatever, and grew up in a nice Democratic voting suburb of progressives. They don't know how to talk to people who believe different things. Maybe they don't necessarily think, oh, those people are bad people, but they are very nervous and gun shy because they have never, I guess, maybe it's just they don't talk to strangers, or they just, the social instinct has been very corralled by kind of, middle-class values or whatever. But the whole lack of wokeness just refers to, like, if you think, a friend of mine once said, like, people are like, oh, the Amber's right wing, or she excuses this or that. And they're like, if you think Amber's bad, wait till you meet literally anyone else. And I think going back to the Fisher stuff of like looking for pariahs, if you actually go around looking for not pariahs, but for potential common ground, if you look at every person as like someone you can talk to, someone with something to say that maybe you can learn from. I mean, humility is a huge thing. Like that maybe you can learn from, and maybe you're not going to win them over to your side and turn them into a Bernie Sanders fan, but at the very least, it's a good interaction. And moving the needle, I think, is really dependent on your ability to talk to everyone. I don't know how to put it. Like, it's just, it sounds so like natural to me, but it's like, it's this idea that it's a special skill or something. And it's like, no, it's not a special skill. You had to unlearn the skills of talking to people. Like, that is kind of what liberal culture did to you. That's what these certain type of social justice educations did to you. I'm not privy to any special communication knowledge. I'm not the working class whisperer or anything. It's that I didn't unlearn the things that I learned growing up. I bristled against a kind of woke stuff pretty early, and it just didn't stick in my head. Maybe I just like don't have the intellectual capacity to internalize it or whatever, but it's been a strength because, you don't have to, there's no special training involved in talking to people. You just do it and then you get better at it. And I just think one of the dangers of wokeness or that kind of ideological imperative of wokeness is that it steals from you your most human and social abilities. Because, some people are better at it than others, but everyone should be able to just talk to people comfortably because they're just a person. Sorry, that was very schmaltzy, but I didn't know how to end it.
Do you reckon wokeness, in a sense, and the kind of theme of wokeness, although it comes from a place of potential inclusivity, it actually comes from a real judgment place? Because, like, from my experience, the people who are like really, really woke, if you put a foot out of line, it's very much like, you can't say this, you can't say that. And then it feels very judgy, while kind of dirtbaggery comes from this like unjudgmental place where it's like just accepting, and it's accepting that we say and do all the wrong things, but we're well-meaning rather than having, the kind of pristine appearance.
Yeah, I mean, I think assuming good intent is kind of at the essence of dirtbaggery, without being gullible. And I think one of the problems with wokeness is that you go into it and you're told, assume good faith. That's one of the rules in a lot of meetings, which is good advice if that's how it actually sort of functions, but it tends not to be. What actually happens is someone will, using the kind of etiquette of or the procedure of the group, be a dick. And then they say, you need to assume good faith right now. So you're expected to, in order to follow this like etiquette, quiet your basic instincts about someone treating you or someone else poorly, while simultaneously looking at everyone outside of the group as a potential enemy. And I don't know, I think people are pretty good at figuring out when someone is contemptuous of them, when someone is being cruel to them, or some subtle passive-aggressive comedy of manners in a DSA organizing chapter type things. But I think the more insular you are within a group, the more difficult it becomes to, one, like speak to people outside of the group and thus expand it, but two, turn a very like clear eye to the internal dynamics of a group. So if you're really like buried in if you've thrown yourself into some sort of political organization and that group has a more or less negative view of people outside of that organization or people more broadly, you're going to retreat into the group, and the group itself becomes like perverse and toxic. And, you know, years go by and you're like, oh my God, did I participate in a show trial? Like Vivian Gornick's The Romance of American Communism is really amazing about this, because there are all these people who did terrible things in their party chapters, just terrible things. And some of them, like to this day, they're like, you know, he was counter-revolutionary. But most of them are like, you have to understand, I don't know why I did that. Someone sat at the trial of their own mother, and like he like lived in shame with it for like the rest of his life. He's like, the thing is, there was nothing but the party, and it eclipsed his life. And eventually he's like, you lose perspective. You don't know how you're supposed to act anymore. And you end up doing terrible things or having terrible things done to you, and maybe even believing that you deserve it. It can be really devastating. So, I mean, again, being a dirtbag essentially, one, cuts people some slack, and two, generally assumes that people are well-meaning and they don't have to have your understanding of the world to have a benevolent spirit. And your argument with them is usually not going to be a moral one. People generally believe that suffering is bad. Your argument with them, or discussion, because if you can just have a discussion and not have it evolve to an argument, is an intellectual one. It's a practical one. It's like, okay, well, you don't think that people should starve. Under this system, people starve. So what I think is this, and I think this works because this, and using a lot of I and like actually talking about yourself, not doing that's another weird middle class thing. It's like, but don't you think? It's like, well, maybe you don't know what they think. Ask them what they think, and just say, well, I think this, and talk like a normal person. But again, all of that has to be predicated on not believing that people are stupid or base or mean. You have to sort of like people to be able to talk to them.
Yeah, I always think with making, I always see it as like this ontologizing effect. So if whenever somebody expresses their view or opinion, and it's for some reason perceived as problematic, so say use the wrong word, and that's I don't know, it's a racist thing to say, for example, it kind of assumes that you have reflected on those views in depth, and you know where they come from, and that you yourself count them as like part of who you are. Maybe that's not very clear, but I'll try to say it in a different
like the
way.
idea of education as being like, or self-reflection as being like your identity. It's like, I'm the sort of person who thinks about these things.
I think that's, so I think that's the presupposition. So, because there's like, we can have that thing where we adopt this self-reflective stance about who we are, and we really rationally or deliberate about what kind of political views we want to hold. That's one side of what it is to be a human being in society. But there's also the other side where we're just a repository of like the fucked up things that kind of get perpetuated through culture and society and stuff like that, and they're just embedded in us, and we get them via a process of osmosis. It's not even necessarily like conscious. We don't consciously like, they don't go through that filter of consciousness. We just absorb them. And it's like there's a talk by Corner
ideology.
Basically. And he's like, he meets someone who goes, oh yeah, I listened to your talks, I'm not racist anymore. Corner West is like, well, I've been being a social activist for 60 years, and I've still got a bit of racism in me. So if I've still got some in me, you've probably got some in you as well. And it's like, you don't need to hold people responsible in some sort of essential way that assumes this ridiculous degree of self-control, you can just look at that as an artifact of the society you live in. You've said something, or you accidentally said something that's kind of sexist, but that's not who you are. That's a reflection of the society you live in.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, again, this is where sort of the bounds of common speech are very helpful. So, again, like ideology, it's like, yes, like people don't, spending all day thinking about the correct way to say something is not a luxury most people have. Most people have shit to do. And learning a private woke language, which, by the way, changes really rapidly, is not on their not at the top of their list. But the idea of common speech, where it's like people know what's commonly acceptable more broadly. If you can have a conversation with a stranger, in a pub back when we still did that, or in a park or whatever, and it could develop into an actual conversation, not just pleasantries, and you don't offend them or upset them, you probably know how to talk. Now, that also may mean that you are using language that is outside of the I'm talking about language, but discussing ideas or using language or introducing theories or values that is outside the kind of like woke lexicon. So unhoused people is the thing that people are saying now instead of like homeless. And I'm like, why do you use a word that I don't know any homeless person has ever used? And that, broadly speaking, there's nothing offensive about the word homeless. It's the word that everyone accepts generally outside of this very niche thing. Unless you're saying there's something wrong or like morally bad about being homeless, I don't understand why this phrase needs an update, except to signify that you're the sort of person that subscribes to the newsletter and gets the new woke updates. So yeah, I mean, it's actually pretty easy to. People don't usually gaffe, like it's pretty easy to have conversations with people without offending them. So this idea that you have to go around telling someone don't use that word, those things don't actually come up that often. And when they do, like, talking to someone with compassion, and I think what you said about like people are preloaded with certain settings, work in progress, like their default might be the wrong language. But the idea of updating language just to signify internally that you all share the same values is really insane to me. I think people should strive to use language well and enjoy it and have fun with it. And certainly, like, don't talk down to people. But also, if you sound weird, if you sound like you're an HR manual, you're not going to relate to people. It's strange. You can't interact with people. And I'm just saying, no one has yet to convince me that there's something superior about saying unhoused. I'm not opposed to change. I'm opposed to a kind of change that I think exists for the sake of change that essentially marks some people as not being in the know, that excludes people, that excludes the broad majority of people who still use the phrase homeless.
Unhoused is a bit weird. It reminds me of like dethroned. So it like implies that someone's unhoused you. Which I don't know, it's pretty radical in a way.
Who
taking your
unhoused
house
you?
away. Yeah.
Yeah. And also it's just maybe it's a technical term that like it just serves no purpose. We already have a term that works, that evokes like pathos in people. People are horrified by homelessness. It's fucking cold out. The idea that you're going to introduce something foreign into people's mouths and brains, which I think can be exciting and, get people talking and really and lead to more understanding. But if you're just going to do it to have an update that shows, oh, by the way, these are the people with a liberal arts degree, they know the correct word. Well, that's to me very exclusionary. And there's nothing wrong with the old word. There's no like a homeless identity politics movement saying we prefer the term unhoused. Like that does not exist.
I would assume it does more damage, because if someone comes to you and says, do you want to help someone who's unhoused, or do you want to help the homeless, the one evokes more emotions. Like, it sounds...
Yeah, they have a whole history with that word. They have imagery, they have stories, whether they have personal experience with it or not. Like, people are aware of homelessness. It is visible, if not in your actual city or community. It's like socially, culturally, publicly visible. To say the unhoused, it's like, well, what is that? Like people in apartments? It both obfuscates the meaning and abandons a word that has very powerful meaning for most people. That's something that is very closely and intimately linked to compassion. It's a good use of language.
It feels, like everything becomes a symbol of something rather than anything else. It doesn't do anything practically by changing the language. And you're also excluding the fact that there's, amongst working class or homeless communities or whatever, there's huge networks of mutual aid happening, and it's not belonging to some sort of, saying I'm signifying that I'm, on the right side of this or something, rather than actually doing anything. It doesn't change anything.
Right.
You can change the language, but it won't actually do anything in practical terms. So it excludes, if you use the wrong language but you're doing something practical, then where does that place you? Is this right or wrong?
Right.
And it becomes a sort of, it's just a symbolic kind of way of saying, yes, I am good, and this is, I care, but okay, but
Yeah, I care. I learned I'm doing all the homework to be a good person. I think actually this stuff is also pernicious because it gives the illusion of activity and of progress and of activism or whatever. It's like, well, what have we done for the homeless lately? Well, we have a new word for them. Like, that's the thing that you got done. It's kind of a distraction from us. Like, well, there's a huge healthcare crisis and food, running water, toilets. The language thing becomes this jarring distraction. And also, it obscures the fact that nothing's actually getting done. It's like, well, we had a meeting. Okay, well, did you get any work done? No, but we had a meeting about it.
It reminds me a bit of, do you know Disney's Song of the South?
Yeah.
Because it's got a lot of that iconography of, like, also a bit like It's a Small World After All. There's bits where, you've got the white kid, the poor white kid, and the rich white kid running up the hill together, and they're all sort of having fun together. But it's all set on a plantation, and it's concealing the darker side that's underneath.
Yeah. It's really interesting, too, because they've taken Song of the South out the catalog, and a friend of mine has a movie podcast, and he interviewed the first Black animator at Disney. He was furious because he's like, first of all, this is like an amazing early piece of animation. Second of all, it's a big piece of history. And third of all, the dark shit of this cartoon is better understood by engaging with it and discussing it. Like when you watch an old war movie and there's like a 10-minute talk at the beginning by Scorsese or something like that. It's like, there's no reason why we can't do that with Song of the South, where it's like, so this did not age well. Let's talk about why. There was also an interesting thing that happened with Dumbo, where there are these characters, it's really interesting, that are like 4 crows. And you can guess where I'm going with this. They were actually voiced by white people, but the stereotype is like meant to like convey a kind of anachronistic Black stereotype. And a friend of mine put it on for his kids recently, and he was like, what do you think about, they're like, oh, we like the crows. And he's like, what do you think he's like trying to tease out of them. He's trying to figure out if they understood that this was like a racist stereotype. And they did not at all, specifically because it's like a racist stereotype from like 1932. And the racist stereotypes we have for Black people in 2021 aren't that they wear spats and smoke cigars. The actual racism is lost on them. Those like signifiers can't embed themselves in their little children brain because it's so far removed historically from, they're smart kids and they're in elementary school, but they understand what racism is. Like, it's just so far removed that like this racist moment is like a floating signifier now. and like the source material of that era of like anti-Black racism is like completely severed. It's just very interesting because he's like, my kids have, I couldn't begin to explain to them that like, this is how people used to make fun of Black people. Because even in their own like contemporary understanding of racism, they're like, but that's not what Black people are like. And it's like, yeah, it's like 100 years old. Like it doesn't, the thing about racism is that it's made up. So you can do updates to it and be racist in new modern ways. And then the old ways, they just look so farcical in hindsight. But yeah, that's a bit of a tangent, but it's just like this very interesting thing that's sort of like hung over from like, oh, people still use this word and they don't know that it's no longer used because it has bad connotations. It's like, well, things update pretty quickly. The ways we used to describe people, both good and bad, become totally irrelevant pretty quickly. So I think we have to deal with stuff that's more substantive and less aesthetic. And also, let's not ruin aesthetics by politicizing them too much.
Yeah, no, I quite often really like just having the opportunity to watch films and then analyse them and think them through.
Yeah.
As well.
And there's stuff that you don't pick up on either without reading. Like there's an essay I read about they're like nefarious gay characters in like 1940s and 50s cinema, and there was like a thing that's like the gay villain, which is like a, you know, they're like a predatory man that takes like a young ingenue and, you know, whatever, exploits her for society or something like that. And it's like, watching some of the movies that they talked about in it, I had no idea that like those characters were supposed to read as gay, because I'm used to my gay stereotypes and I could point those out, but the characters would have read to gay to audiences at the time. It was just a completely different kind of archetype, I guess. It's fun to like get to read about this stuff and to get like the keys to something that just on surface might be a book or a movie that you don't have the means or the lens to understand without some like historical and cultural context.
So there's two pieces that you've sort of written for Jacobin lately, and they both to me sort of seemed interesting because they've sort of explored failure. So they're both in sort of 2020, but one was with Daniel Bresner, entitled "Are the Democrats Losing on Purpose?" To sort of explore whether Democrat politicians might have an incentive to lose elections. And the later piece was entitled "The Problem of Hashtag Activism," and you sort of explored how sort of defenders of hashtag activism sort of have a strange metric for judging failure and success. And so you trace this to sort of an emphasis on liberal moralism, as opposed to sort of a socialist transformation of society or sort of material transformation of society. But I sort of thought what was interesting and I wanted to ask you about was really, in what respect does liberalism have like a problem with this concept of failure? And is that sort of something that's sort of tied up with liberalism?
Yeah, so I think the issue is that there's a sort of progressive triumphalism where it's like everything new that happens is progress and this is the way things are supposed to happen. So obviously like this is good. So I think some of it just comes from the sort of progressivist ethos of like things are going in the direction they have to. So there's that. That's a huge stumbling block. To say that, for example, maybe going back to the tech things, maybe everyone staying at work to eat lunch is a sign of a bad thing. Maybe this new sort of cultural feature is, we can be ambivalent about it even. Maybe it's complicated. So I think the resistance to view sometimes change as bad is part of it, because that people don't want to be thought of as conservative or reactionary. They're like, no, I like change. I like new things. I want to adapt. And it's like, well, not all adaptations are good. The other thing is that there is no real substance to, at least in America, like the Democratic Party's sort of liberal politics. There's no like, look, workers built the world, workers deserve to run it, or a fair and just king shall make laws for us all, or any kind of like general principles of leadership. It's kind of an abstraction. It's like the country itself needs to run well. So liberals, in particular Democrats at least, are very managerial. So they're focused on the systems and all the moving parts, like moving well together. That's a sign of their success. What the machine does to human beings, totally secondary to them. Obviously, this provides a sort of a definition of success, which doesn't take into account what the vast masses of people actually want. So they can be like, what are you talking about? We got Obamacare, you know, and it's like, we got it. We have a program. The program is running. And there's no question of like, well, these are really terrible. The only good thing about it was the Medicaid expansion, and people are still uninsured and they're in incredible medical debt. And this essentially shored up the monopoly of healthcare for the private insurance companies. I think liberalism is fundamentally technocratic. So their definition, again, of failure is just so far removed from mine, or I think most people's. Because it's all about, we did a scheme and the scheme is operating now. Look at all the new things we're doing. And it completely divorces itself from the idea of like, okay, well, are people making more money? Are they working less? Are they in less debt? It allows them to stay away from the concrete politics of daily life for people. It's kind of a technocratic fetishism. Like they are really obsessed with the country as an abstraction and not as a place that is full of people who need certain things.
In the Damage magazine, you write a piece called I'm Not Wearing a Mask, and you write, I understand the libidinal urge to be constrained, restricted, and dominated. But can't people just find someone to choke them during sex instead, like a normal person? So what would you see as like the problem with moralism as a sort of political strategy, and how do we sort of circumvent it?
So thanks for using one of my better jokes. I love hearing everything, anything I've written being read back to me, which I suppose is a good sign. The moralism thing, I think, again, it has to do with the idea that it's a default setting for people. It is historically a major basis for social movements associated with liberalism and associated with progressivism, even insofar as like, you know, people consider themselves the inheritors of the Enlightenment tradition and things like that. It's also like a quick and easy way to people's hearts and brains is to be like, look at this bad thing. Do you want to do this? You know, do you want to stop the bad thing? Do you want to make the good thing? So I think people lean on it heavily because it's reliable and because it's especially in the States, it's a big part of American culture. Is this, you know, it's a very Protestant country. It's like virtue is a very big thing. The idea of a deserving poor versus an undeserving poor, these things are very much woven into, they put that kind of ideology just in the tap water. My response to it, at least rhetorically, has always been setting the floor for what I find acceptable much higher for every single person. So it requires, I guess, a sort of like universalism, or this is turning tangential, but I've always said, look, I want better for every bastard, where it's like a piece of shit like deserves better than what America is willing to give them. I want better for everyone comprehensively, for the worst people, and caring about people who you wouldn't necessarily like, not merely because it's like the moral or virtuous thing to do, which, you know, you can fall back into that trap very easily and be like, oh, I minister to the sinners. Like it's not that either. But because you have a sense of self-interest, but you have a sense of collective self-interest, where it's no man left behind. You know, every single person deserves certain things. Once we start deciding that this or that person is not worthy, or they're too immoral, or, you know, they're not sophisticated or educated or woke or whatever enough to be deserving of this or that, we completely erode the entire project, which includes you and me and the people that are at the absolute margins of society. I think the only escape from moralism is essentially collectivism. It's to acknowledge that we do have moral values, but, you know, we also have social ethics that we're more closely in agreement on, that are like socially mediated. But what we look for in politics is political solutions to, you know, those moral and ethical problems. And they won't be like obviously complete, but, you know, if you want people to be kind and compassionate and responsible to one another, well, then like human dignity is pretty much a prerequisite. So we really need to set the floor for absolutely everyone higher. And again, these are just like conversations that I end up having ad nauseum, and I don't know how effective they are, but people do tend to respond well to, no, I want better for every bastard. I think the worst people deserve better. I think we have to set just a base level for a life and certain rights that everyone gets, no matter what, no matter how shitty a human being they are. And that's, I think people actually just sort of resonate with that honesty rather than trying to argue on a case-by-case basis of, you know, what is this morally defensible? Because then you just get into the weeds. Maybe it's not morally defensible. Maybe that person did something truly cruel and shitty. Maybe they're pathologically shitty, but they still deserve human dignity. That means economic security, a clean environment, some control over their life, access to healthcare, childcare, all those things. You just have to get away from the individual, and it means moving towards like an idea of collective self-interest.
It's like, you know, if you start talking about this person that doesn't deserve healthcare or whatever, then you can that can be a good way for a particular political system to then take away healthcare for everybody.
Yeah.
People that aren't worthy, effectively.
Yeah, it erodes the entire idea of kind of like universal rights. And like when people start saying like words like deserve, and I'm like, what is deserve? Deserve is a fake word. And as a socialist, I don't deal in deserve, because terrible things, you know, acts of God, whatever, happen to people at random. You know, life is chaos. My political project is not doling out punishment or suffering. My political project is to establish a sense of power that benefits the broad population and alleviates suffering. So who cares? Like, deserve is stupid. I know that people deserve more, so I'm just going to go with that. That seems like a more productive way of doing things.
Jumping back, it's just like I'm a bit slow, but just jumping back to something that you said, like that point about kind of like the democratic aspect of what it means to go out and just talk to people and socialize to people really resonates, I think, kind of with what you're saying, even there as well. I think that there's something about HR policy which tells you which sort of neutralizes a workplace and compartmentalizes it, means that you don't have to confront the fact that people are different and come from different positions and talk in different ways and will have problematic views. And that's kind of like, I think that maybe the danger of wokeness. I don't usually normally use that word, so it's exciting for me to say. But like perhaps the problem with wokeness is this rather this neutralizing, this refusing to engage with people that talk in a different way, rather than saying, because right. Something that really reminded me of a personal experience was somebody, when I was working in a factory last year, used the N-word like really aggressively to describe something, and I kind of instinctively went up to him and was like, dude, that's not very cool.
Yeah, it's the main word.
Yeah, and it's just like, I think that there's a difference between, personally, I thought there was a difference between that and wokeness, in that at least you're engaging and there's a conversation to be had, rather than saying, right. Oh, I can't believe you just said that. That's so rude. You're an awful person.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is sort of an excuse, right? One, to hand off what little power you have, which is your interaction with your coworker, essentially giving more power to the employer, because you could have just gone to your employer and been like, fire this guy, which not only would have sort of undermined your own ability to talk to this person, which as a coworker, you are more likely to relate to this person and change their mind than a boss is. Like, I resent, obviously, authority figures telling me what is and what is not acceptable. But also, he's not going to be less racist after getting fired from his job. That doesn't fix the problem. So I think in some ways it's sort of an abdication of responsibility to say that, this person's a bad person, just to write them off. It's lazy. And obviously, like, you're not going to like go around evangelizing everyone and convert everyone to whatever your chosen set of mores are. But you do, I think, have a responsibility to engage with people and not immediately appeal to the same authority that's exploiting you, because like you're in the same class as that person. Tattling, that is kind of a last resort thing. I mean, you really have to have no other recourse, I think, to politically justify going to the boss about something that a coworker is doing. That is a nuclear option and a last ditch thing to do.
Yeah, and it's also just incredibly undemocratic. It's just another way of avoiding having to deal in the messy place of being alive and being human.
Yeah. It's appealing to authority. It's tattling. No one likes a tattletale.
So criticising Aaron Bastani's fully automated luxury communism and Sophie Lewis's full surrogacy now, you say, instead of working for the world that represents the values of the people who live in it, the left imagines a new kind of people that might fit into the worlds they fantasize about, or perhaps merely see as inevitable. So I thought this was a really interesting critique, but then this kind of got me sort of thinking about what is it that people actually want, or what is it specifically maybe that the working class wants. So given that these kind of terms like the people or the working class are sort of quite amorphous, contradictory categories, so how should we sort of think about what these groups are and what they want?
This is obviously like a sticky sort of thing, like what people actually want, because obviously people are individuals and they have different dreams and goals and values. And, they want all kinds of things. And I don't think setting or establishing sort of an ideal for people to want or a prescription for what people should want is going to be fruitful or productive. That said, I think it makes sense to think of things in terms of freedom, like what people want, broadly speaking, is freedom. And teasing that out, obviously, is like a more expansive conversation, but it does involve examining broader social values. And I think it's totally possible to do that without making some sort of mass generalization or appealing to sort of social conformity. So there's freedom from, which is like the big thing that Americans are really bad at. We have a lot of freedom too. People want freedom to say what they want, to, go about their lives unmolested, like basic sort of civil liberties. But freedom from want, freedom from suffering, freedom from ill health, freedom from, these things are related too, because like freedom from oppression also means freedom to speak or make art or do whatever. But I think you want to start from a situation where you look at the broad populace, you take a kind of a straw poll about what their bigger concerns are, and you start from there and you start sort of crafting policy from the perspective of expanding people's freedoms. So with something like with Sophie Lewis's book, or with surrogacy as a broader sort of concept, like one, I think the idea that, for people who haven't heard of the book, she has this idea that people, that having children biologically, like with like a female womb, is like extremely like miserable and oppressive, and we should be able to like use other people's wombs, which, by the way, I think she missed that this already kind of happens, and it has to do with very wealthy women just basically renting the wombs of the third world. It's actually pretty dystopian and like J.G. Ballard and horrifying. But what she is talking about doesn't necessarily reflect zero desire. I think there are people who would like to have a kid, but can't be physically pregnant or don't want to be physically pregnant for a number of reasons. That said, in the US, women polled kind of over and over again about like what their sort of like family concerns and reproductive concerns are. It's mostly people saying, I would like to have a kid, but I can't because I can't afford it. Or I would like to have another kid, but I can't because I can't afford it. There's major issues with abortion access in America now, and it's increasingly getting worse, mainly through austerity rather than like the actual legal obstacles. But still, the biggest concern is people are like, it's like the fertility rate is dropping and people are not happy about it. They actually do want families. Now, I don't think we have to craft a policy which encourages reproduction to the deficit of people who don't want families or don't want to reproduce biologically. But I do think it's a good place to start with like, oh, there's a lot of people who can't provide for the kids that they have or can't have a kid. So yeah, I mean, you start from the general and then you move on to the specific to make sure that like these things are not exclusionary. That I think is broadly accomplished with like welfare policies and, a more empowered working class. But there's no way that universal childcare or children's aid or universal health care does anything to negatively affect, like, say, the Sophie Lewises of the world who do not want to biologically have children. It still benefits them. One, that everyone else has, childcare and whatnot. But two, because it's not just children using healthcare. You'll use the healthcare too. In terms of like her wanting to do the surrogacy stuff, it's like, I mean, those are arrangements that occur between women socially too, as well. But the interjection of the profit motive into it turns it into literally you're renting a third world woman's womb. That's like really dystopian to me. And I think the broader sort of population would sort of agree. So I don't think that that's a bad instinct. I don't think dealing with people's immediate sort of desires and impulses and wants is a bad thing. And I don't think, talking about the general and what most people usually want need necessarily occur at the expense of people who want something different, who want a different kind of life or a different type of family or a different type of way of being. But yeah, I understand like people, they worry about normativity and, reification and things like that. But it's like, no one's going to make you be a housewife just because we have like socialized childcare or something like that. Let's focus on the thing first that affects the largest amount of people. And that in turn provides at least the framework for alternatives to things like, the traditional family, just as an example. That's very rambling, but does that make sense? It's very hard to talk about like normativity or whatever.
I realised that I probably left quite a difficult question right to the end.
Yeah. It's like, I looked at that when I'm like, oh, I'll figure it out when I'm talking about it. And then I'm like, that's actually hard. So I should probably write that. Like, what do people want? Why? And what do we, what should people want? And should we be asking ourselves, what should people want? But I'm not in the business of telling people so much what they should want. I like to look at what people do want and be like, well, the political project is about getting to very core desires and providing the kind of egalitarian economic and political world that gets them what they want. And you know what? Maybe after that, what they want might change. We can deal with that then. Right now, there are immediate concerns.
One of the things that I did think, because you talked earlier about sort of the alt-right person that joined the union. And I suppose what's interesting about unions is doesn't really care about it does care about what you want, but it doesn't care about sort of more about collectively working out what you want through that process.
Yeah. I mean, it subsumes the individual into the collective in a way that does provide more individual freedom, which I think is like the counterintuitive thing that people don't get. In America, sometimes people are like, I don't want to be accountable to a union. It's like, look, you're accountable to somebody. So it's either the boss or the people you work with. And if you pick the boss, I have to think that either you think one day you're going to be the boss, or for some reason your allegiances do not lie with your fellows. And so your project there is to be like, look, you have these interests. You should go through us because there's more of us. There's like one boss. I mean, you might have a ton of bosses or whatever, but it's like, there's more of us. They need us. We don't need them. Go with the winning team. Join the union. Don't be a company man or whatever. I don't know if there's British slang for it or whatever, but, don't be a rat. I think people actually respond well to that because it's like, we are getting you the freedom that you want because our collective self-interest provides freedom. So yes, you are accountable to the union, but the union is accountable to you. Right now, you're just accountable to your boss and he doesn't owe you shit. So if you take on this responsibility, if you take on this accountability to the union, you essentially have, you're buying into something that's two-sided, something at which, there's reciprocity involved. So you're not just being leached off of for dues. Like, this is the thing that gets you power. This is the thing that gets you freedom. This is the thing that expands your ability to live in the world and to control your life.
I suppose it's kind of coming up to like 10:30 our time. I don't know what time it is for you, Amber.
It's like 2:20 now for me. It's a lovely afternoon. I would plug also that Miya Tokumitsu book, Do What You Love Again, just because I touched on it briefly, but it's really great.
I would like to ask you about your book, actually. That was one thing.
Okay. Yeah. I'm supposed to be, that's why I'm in the cabin, is that I'm supposed to be finishing it. But yeah, essentially like political memoir and kind of for people around my age, for millennials, for people who graduated after the 2008 financial collapse, it became clear that like actually history is not over. Things are happening. So it's a relatively sequential but like collection of essays about like what happened with the kind of Bernie and to some degree Corbyn moments, what it meant that after we decided that socialism was dead in like the late 80s, early 90s, that we're like, actually, no, wait, because liberalism isn't working either. But of course, it's all just written by me. So it's a ton of jokes and funny stories about getting drunk, but with politics.
I was going to mention there's actually a meme online of telling reactionaries they should join unions and various left-wing things.
Really?
So, like, people will engage them in a chat but will purposely not use words like socialism or anything that will scare them off.
Yeah.
And then they'll like, yeah, I feel that. How do I fight it? Unions. And then there's like a meme of like pages where loads of people have posted them. And,
right, yeah.
I think it's really positive. It's just like getting loads of these people that are disenfranchised and then putting them around people that hopefully are going to have better like politics to guide them, for one, and then also their needs are in the same as everyone else's. So having representation is good for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, we're building up the ranks, and it's also like this fear of like people, infecting you. It's like, how are you so insecure? You think you're going to hang out with someone with like, bad, maybe kind of backward ideas that you're going to become backward? Like, are you that impressionable? You should be the one giving the impression. Like, and if you're in a union with this person, they're going to be influenced by you and the union. You're the actor here. Like you're the, I mean, whatever, subjectivity, objectivity, whatever. Like, have a little more confidence in what you believe. If you believe that you're right and you're fortunate enough to be able to be in an organizing capacity with a bunch of people, well, I mean, have faith that the influence of your collective self-interest is only going to sort of enrich people's understanding of the world for the better.
Thank you very much. It was really, really good.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
been really great. And if anyone wants to sort of hang around afterwards,
Yeah, it's great.
feel free to sort of stick around. But yeah.
I think I have to go buy food at the general store in this like one horse town I'm in. But yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a lovely break from the wilderness, which is gorgeous, but somewhat isolated. So yeah, I'd love to keep me abreast of things you're doing in the future.
Yeah, well, I've got your E1 Messenger anyway. So.
Yeah. My only I don't have a Facebook, but I do have Facebook Messenger.
Yeah.
Like, people can't find me unless they already found me. Very sneaky about my online stuff.
Yeah, no, you are actually quite hard to.
I'm hard to track down by design. Yeah, literally hiding in the woods. Yeah, like a Sasquatch. All right. Thanks so much. It was lovely meeting everyone. It's good talk. Hopefully I didn't ramble too much.
Thanks. It was brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this podcast and you'd like to hear more, please check out our website at www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube and SoundCloud. Exploding Appendix, ideas and culture with guts. Cause I'm just a leftist dirtbag, baby. Yeah, I'm just a leftist dirtbag, baby. Listen to Chapo Trap House, baby, with me. Oh, cause I'm just a leftist dirtbag, baby. Yeah, I'm just a leftist dirtbag, baby. Listen to Chapo Trap House, baby, with me. Oh.